CVSS scores, understanding the basics. Welcome to our quick guide on the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, or CVSS. In this session, you'll understand how we score the severity of vulnerabilities in the cybersecurity world. CVSS is a standardized framework used to assess the severity of security vulnerabilities, helping organizations prioritize their responses. CVSS scores are composed of three main components: the base score, the temporal score, and the environmental score. The base score evaluates the inherent characteristics of a vulnerability, including exploitability and impact metrics. Exploitability metrics consider how a vulnerability can be exploited. This includes factors like the attack vector, attack complexity, privileges required, and whether user interaction is needed. Impact metrics measure the potential effects on confidentiality, integrity, and availability of the affected system. The temporal score adjusts the base score based on factors that evolve over time, such as the availability of an exploit code, the effectiveness of mitigations, and the confidence in the report. The environmental score tailors the base score to reflect the specific context of an organization, considering factors like security requirements and the impact on the particular environment. CVSS scores range from 0 to 10, where higher scores indicate more severe vulnerabilities. These scores are also categorized qualitatively from none to critical. Let's take a look at an example. In an operating system, let's say a security researcher finds a vulnerability. For this vulnerability to be exploited, an attacker needs local access to the server. The vulnerability can be exploited without needing admin access. As no admin access is required, the security researcher considers this a low complexity vulnerability. The researcher also considers this vulnerability to be of critical severity. Now let's consider a second researcher who finds the exact same vulnerability but considers it to be of low criticality. Why the confusion? Both researchers have different understanding and are not following a common standard. This is where the CVSS scoring comes in, standardizing how vulnerabilities are categorized and making the calculation of severity more consistent across the board. CVSS has undergone several iterations and versions to improve its accuracy and relevance. Each version has incorporated feedback from the security community to ensure it remains a robust and effective tool for vulnerability management. CVSS scores help organizations prioritize their response to vulnerabilities, ensuring that the most critical issues are addressed first. Widely adopted by security frameworks and organizations, CVSS is a cornerstone of effective vulnerability management. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into CVSS scores in our next segment. We'll take a look at an actual vulnerability, and then we'll walk through how to use CVSS scores and give you some more information to help you use within your vulnerability management. Hello and welcome back. As I mentioned, we are going to take a look at an actual vulnerability that's out there, and we're going to look at the CVSS score. We'll be using the CVSS 3.1 specification document to guide us in this effort, and then we're going to take a look at some of the metrics that have been assigned to the CVSS score, and we'll actually determine if we agree or not with that CVSS scoring. One of the things that I did want to mention as we talk about CVSS score is to understand that these are done with the best effort. However, as we mentioned, if you look at my screen on the right hand side, there are a lot of things that go into assigning these metrics, such as the base metric, the temporal, and environmental. And I kind of explained that during our short video, where a lot of these, some may be based on your environment, how it applies to your environment, and so forth, and other external factors and things like that. So as much as a CVSS score may be super high, it can be applicable differently within your environment and so forth, depending on a lot of the parameters that exist as far as that vulnerability is concerned for you. So one of the things that I did want to spend just a couple of minutes to talk about is the concept of a CVE. So CVEs, as you can see here on the left side of my screen, there's one CVE here, there's another one, and then there's a few of them. What CVEs are basically like the IDs that are attached to a vulnerability. So if you were to go into a vulnerability database and you wanted to look up certain vulnerabilities, they usually are assigned with numbers. Typically they start with the year they were identified, and then these other numbers sort of like attached to them based on when and so forth and other parameters. Now if you take a look at this, you can see that it says CVE 2013.3993, and as you can see, it was ideally identified in 2013. It looks like it was actually published in July 2014. Same here, if we look at this one, you'll see that it says 2010. That actually was published in 2010 and so forth. So they typically are applicable within the years that we find, that's the years that they were actually discovered and so forth. So just wanted to talk about CVEs briefly. We'll cover this in another video entirely because this is a whole topic on its own that we'll cover in a separate video. I did want to just concentrate on CVSS scores. That said, each CVE has a CVSS score assigned to it. So as you can see on the right hand screen here, the severity for this particular vulnerability is 3.1. Sorry, it's using the specification 3.1 for CVSS scoring, and as you can see, it says it's 6.5 at a medium. And then using version 2 of the CVSS scoring system, it's actually 3.5. I did mention also in our short video that CVSS scoring has undergone several iterations, and currently the highest version is version 4.0, if you can see up here. On my right hand side on this window, you can see that we're on first.org site. First.org is pretty much the entity that was responsible for kind of coming up with the CVSS scoring and metrics and calculation. And a lot of times what I love to do is usually, go and use this as reference to kind of understand whatever CVSS score has been assigned to a CVE, which is the vulnerability itself. On the left side here, I'm highlighting again. That's to kind of aid you in determining even if you think or agree with the scoring that's been assigned to that CVSS score, to that vulnerability. My apologies. So that's it. Two things to note here. First.org, this is the site. This is the entity that's responsible for coming up with the specification documents for assigning the CVSS scores and the calculation. I did mention it's gone over several iterations. As you can see, there's a version 1 down here, there's version 2, version 3.0, 3.1, and all the way up to version 4, which is the current specification. So you always, if you go into each of the versions, they have something different. So if I go to version 2, it tells you sort of like the parameters and so forth. If you look at the complete documentation, it'll show you how the calculation is done and so forth, what is defined as what and so forth. So as I mentioned, we are going to use 3.1 for this vulnerability that I will be looking at, or we'll be looking at together. So let me just go back to that, and I'll just go back to let me just hit back. Yep, so I'm back to that. Cool. Now back to the left side. So NVD, which is the National Vulnerability Database, is pretty much the repository for all data vulnerability information. This is where you can look up all kinds of vulnerabilities, look up their corresponding CVSS scores and so forth. A lot of the data that's in here is what's built into many of our vulnerability scanning systems, such as the Qualyses and Nessus scanners and so forth. So this is where you find NVD is pretty much like the one that hosts the repository for all known vulnerabilities and CVEs and so forth, with their corresponding CVSS scores. That said, let's take a look at an actual vulnerability, and what I have is this one. Let me go to that tab. So we have a CVE 2016-5002, and if you look at the description down here, it says, I'm gonna make this bigger. If you look at the description down here, it says XML external entity vulnerability in Apache XML RPC, aka WS-XML RPC library 3.1. That version of that library, as used in Apache, allows remote attackers to conduct server-side request forgery. So server-side request forgery is a vulnerability that allows an attacker to be able to do something within the backend on your server, and we are going to be using the version 3.1 as I mentioned. So just to explain what this looks like here, if you look at the metrics, we can go to version 4.0 just to show you kind of like the different things that they look at. And then when we go to version 2, you notice version 2, this actually says it's a 9.3, and we're looking at the vectors such as attack vector. If I highlight over this, you can see the attack vector. All these little abbreviations or letters indicate the different parts of the vulnerabilities. So you can see AV is attack vector, AC is access complexity, which is basically medium. AU is authentication, C, which is like complete, and some other additional information. I am going to be referencing version 3.1. What I'm trying to do here is we are going to look at what it's been rated as, and then we're going to use our specification here on the right hand side to see if we even agree or not with this rating or the score that's been given here as far as this vulnerability is concerned. So let's dive right into it. What I'm gonna do is pretty much highlight this so we can see the entire thing. So if you look at this vulnerability, it's saying that the base score is 7.8, which is high. And the attack vector, when you look at the different vectors, the attack vector says low, attack complexity says low as well, privileges required says none, user interaction says required, scope is unchanged, confidentiality is high, integrity is high, availability is high. Okay, so just walking through them. Attack vector simply refers to, and actually rather than me explaining it, let me go to the right side so we can look at what these reference. So in attack vector, this metric reflects the context by which a vulnerability exploitation is possible. Basically saying, what is the way that we can, how is this vulnerability exploited? What is the attack vector, so forth. And then there's several parameters that it defines. There's network, there's adjacent, there's local, and then there's physical. So with network, it says the vulnerable component is bound to the network stack, and a set of possible attackers extends beyond the other options listed below, and so forth. You can look at each of these to figure out the different meanings and so forth. What I am interested in here is it says, if you go back to the left side, it says the attack vector is local. So let's see if we agree with this. What we do know about this vulnerability is it's the server-side request forgery. We also know that it allows remote attackers to conduct server-side request forgery. So let's see if we agree with this local specification. So on the local, it says the vulnerable component is not bound to the network stack, and the attacker's path is via read, write, execute capabilities. Either A, the attacker exploits the vulnerability by accessing the target systems locally, example keyboard, blah, blah, blah. The attacker relies on user interaction by another person to perform actions required to exploit the vulnerability. Now, that said, I actually disagree with the local, because this clearly even indicates it in there. It says it's a remote. You can exploit this vulnerability via remote. In a server-side request forgery, as much as the attack may be happening on the local system itself, but the attack vector, which is the initial foothold, is via a remote. It's via a remote path. So you just need to be on the other side of that network to initiate this attack. So that said, where you can see that local here may not be the right specification for this. Now, what's the next thing? It says attack complexity is low. So let's look at attack complexity. This describes the conditions beyond the attacker's control that must exist in order to exploit the vulnerability. And then when we look at the low specification, specialized access conditions or extenuating circumstances do not exist, an attacker can expect repeatable success when attacking the vulnerable component. Okay. And then for high, a successful attack depends on conditions beyond the attacker's control. That is, a successful attack cannot be accomplished at will, but requires the attacker to invest in some measurable amount of effort. The attacker must gain or gather knowledge about the environment which the vulnerable target exists, blah, blah, blah. When we look at this, attack complexity low, I definitely agree with that part of it, because there's not a lot of things that the attacker needs to know. Once they discover the vulnerability, which is an SSR vulnerability, they simply need to initiate that attack. There's not really a lot of complexity involved in this, other than say finding that SSR vulnerable endpoint and saying, look, do this activity in the backend, or force the server to do this particular activity. So I do agree with that one. So let's keep moving on, and let's see privileges required. It says none. Let's look at privileges required here under our metric. This metric describes the level of privileges an attacker must possess before successfully exploiting the vulnerability. The base score is greatest if no privileges are required. So let's see what it has here. Privileges required, none. Under the none specification, it says the attacker is authorized and the attacker is unauthorized prior to attack and therefore does not require any access to settings or files. And then for low, the attacker requires privileges. For high, the attacker requires privileges that provide significant administrative. That said, I also agree with that part of it, the rating here or the metric here, because there really isn't any required authentication or authorization if it's a vulnerable endpoint, SSRF endpoint that's already out there, that's discovered. Now, where it could be subjective a little bit is depending on what the attacker might be trying to do with that SSRF. For example, if I'm doing a simple port scan on the network via this server-side request forgery attack, which is I'm using this SSRF vulnerability to do other things like trying to scan the environment for other open ports, trying to find services and so forth. That could be that at some point it may require certain privileges or not. Now, or if I'm trying to pivot into a different system on the network that may be locked down and so forth, that may require the privilege. But as it is right now with the SSR vulnerability, there's really not much needed. So I definitely agree with that. As far as privileges required, should be none or is none. User interaction says required. Now let's look at that definition. This metric captures the requirement for a human user other than the attacker to participate in the successful compromise of the vulnerable component. This metric determines whether the vulnerability can be exploited solely at the will of the attacker. Let's look at the specifications. None. The vulnerable system can be exploited without interaction from any user. And then required, under required, it says a successful exploitation of this vulnerability requires a user to take some action before the vulnerability can be exploited. For example, a successful exploit may be only possible during the installation of an application by a system. And let's see what it actually says. It says user interaction required. Now, that is, I disagree initially with this because in an SSR vulnerability, I guess if you want to call it user interaction from the attacker's perspective, yes, but in many ways this specification almost sounds like it's defining user interaction as in like on the server side. So this could be a tiny bit subjective as well too, but what I would definitely say is, for me, I would actually say none in the extent that if it's from the attacker's perspective, based on this definition, from the attacker's perspective, that would be none other than just exploiting the vulnerability. But if this is what is defining here, as far as like something happening on the users on their compromised system, then maybe. So this could be a little bit subjective. So, but let's keep going on. And then scope is unchanged. So this is an interesting one too. Scope metric captures whether a vulnerability in one vulnerable component impacts resources and components beyond its security scope. That's a very good one too. And I'm not going to read this whole thing, but let's look at the definitions. So for unchanged, an exploited vulnerability can only affect resources managed by the same security authority. In this case, the vulnerable component and the impacted component are either the same or both are managed by the same security authority. And then for change, an exploited vulnerability can affect resources beyond the security scope managed by the security authority of the vulnerable. This is a very good one too in terms of subjectiveness. And the reason I say this is, if we look at unchanged, let's see what they actually rated it here. They actually rated it as unchanged. If we look at unchanged, it's basically saying, okay, like you exploit this vulnerability, anything within its scope is sort of like part of this. In this case, the vulnerable component and the impacting component are the same. So think of like, if we have networks and you have network segmentation in place and so forth, then it's saying, well, if I can exploit this vulnerability, let's say I'm doing a port scan, I can scan other systems within this. I agree with that. However, if we say for change, it's saying that this can affect other resources beyond the security scope. That can also be possible by, in the extent that, assuming you now are within the system, you're able to exploit other systems, you're able to do port scans, you're able to run services and figure out other components that are vulnerable and so forth. Let's say there's some API implemented on this server, or let's say there's some other servers that basically leads you to having more rights in terms of like administrative or root access to a system that allows you to pivot even outside of that network that you're currently in. Then we could also say change could be applicable here. And I'll give an example. Say like you're in a container environment, and once you're somehow able to exploit this initial SSR vulnerability into something else that helps you escape this container environment, and now you're into like your host systems and other systems, then we could say that. So this could also be very subjective in many ways, and so forth. I'm not sure if you're noticing the pattern here, but CVSS scoring, just like with any other risk that we measure, is kind of like subjective based on your environment, based on your business, based on your systems, based on the things that exist within your environment, so forth. So I hope you're picking up the pattern here. One of the things that you should always note is these numbers help you at least at the base. That's why the name base score. It helps you at least say, look, starting at this baseline, this is how high this is, and I should be taking a look at this. However, everything becomes more in context of your environment, in context of your application, in context of whatever you're running within your environment. So let's see if we've gone through all of it. The others are typically very easy. Confidentiality is high. This can lead to a compromise of confidential data. Integrity, this can lead to is high. Availability is high, and so forth. So hopefully this was a little bit of a, I know we kind of rushed through it and so forth, but what I would say just for practice, if you're trying to get a lot more understanding of this, try to do this a lot on your own, and pretty much go to NVD and also use first.org, open up a specification, open up a vulnerability, and see if you can do these matchings. I hope this was super helpful, and so and then we'll hopefully kind of cover CVE in another video in one of our episodes. But this is just this was to give you a high-level overview of CVSS score and how they work. Mind you, these numbers are always a starting point for you to use within your vulnerability management. However, they should always be in context to what you have within your environment. And as I mentioned, all risks are created differently, and each and every enterprise or application's risk are different, and therefore should be very applicable in context to that application or environment, and so forth. So thanks for joining me again, and we'll catch you on our next episode. Bye.